Hi everyone, today I'll be going over my presentation titled Education Through Public and Private Schools. Quick overview on what I'll be covering over my presentation. So government-run public schools versus private schools, and I'll be focusing on the K through 12 education system. I'll be going over some of the similarities between public and private schools, some of their key differences that set them apart from one another, and then a little bit of discussion on, does it really matter whether you go to a public school or private school, and is there even a need to have the distinction between the two? And the last page would be just some references for my material. Two of the biggest similarities between public and private sector education is obviously, the main purpose for either institution is to educate the youth. Their organizational structure is almost identical with a few key differences, but overall it's the same type of bureaucracy as described by Weber. You have a clear chain of command. Each school, whether it be high school, middle school, or elementary school, has their principal at the top, followed by their administrative staff and then teachers. Along with some of the concepts of Weber, obviously you want the most qualified personnel to take the positions of teachers. This is done by only hiring teachers that are certified and have gone through the proper training to become to take those positions and teach those specific subjects. So that's how both public and private institutions are similar in that fashion. Here we'll go over some of the differences between private and public education systems. I think it's easier to see the differences. We'll go over them one by one. So accessibility. It's obviously public education is open to everyone. Everyone has a right to get an education for free, and here, at least in the United States. But if you're talking about private schools, only usually the case is, since private schools are a lot more expensive to attend, usually only the wealthy class is able to send their children to these private institutions. And usually the demographics in public schools is very diverse versus the private sector. In private schools, the majority of the attending class is primarily rich white upper class individuals. So here you clearly see the differences between accessibility between lower income minority groups for public education versus private education institutions. Accountability. Public schools have to make sure that they meet all the standards set by each individual state that they operate in, versus private institutions have a more laxed accountability. They don't really have to be accountable to the state, although they do have to meet some requirements and standards, but they're not as rigorous as for those for public schools. And public schools, obviously, you have the teachers and public opinion that goes into effect on how schools should be run and if they're not running efficiently. Another big difference between public and private schools is the curriculum. While public schools have a clear guideline on which curriculum they have to teach in their classes, private institutions or private schools are able to teach whatever they want in their curriculum. Obviously, they're going to teach the basic math, English, and science to meet some of the standards set by the state. But otherwise, their curriculum, they could teach anything they want, and the teaching styles can vary. They have more flexibility in that manner versus public schools have a more strict guided way of teaching. So does this all matter? I think it very much does matter in the sense of equal opportunity. Public schools allow at least the possibility of everyone to get an education and better themselves for their future. It's nice to have options to send your kids to private schools if you can afford it. It's definitely a nice ability to be able to do so. But through public education, obviously private institutions and private schools were around way before public schools. And with public schools, it's been a slow progression on improving the quality of education. Early on, obviously the schools were segregated, and it wasn't until 1954 when Brown versus Board, the U.S. Supreme Court decided to end segregation in schools. And then later on in the 1960s and 70s, the federal government enacted further laws to improve education quality in public schools to minority groups. And recently, under the George W. Bush administration, they had implemented the No Child Left Behind, which implemented more federal guidelines and policies set in place to improve public education, not just for minorities, but for all individuals and all students. So this slow progression in enactments of laws to help improve public education, it's a clear example of Lindblom's theories of muddling through small changes in policy over time versus big drastic changes. So these are just some of the topics I'll be going further into depth in my paper on the differences between public and private education systems. Here's a short list of references I used for my presentation, and I hope everyone has a nice week. Thank you.